All right, here we go. Today we have Mike Benz, who is a White House speechwriter and tech policy advisor. He later worked at the State Department running the cyber portfolio in the Economic Bureau. Today, Mike Benz is executive director of the Foundation for Freedom Online, who's a free speech watchdog dedicated to restoring the promise of a free and open internet. Mike Benz, welcome to Vlad TV.
Thanks for having me, Vlad.
Absolutely. We actually met on X because you had reposted my Tekashi interview.
I thought it was a work of art.
Thank you. You actually said, hold on, what was the tweet? You said, watching the Tekashi 6ix9ine interview and noting there's more journalistic integrity in basic hip-hop YouTube journalism than in any mainstream media correspondent in the White House press.
It's true. You just don't see that kind of holding yourself to account, holding your feet to the fire. I mean, it's there's a realness that I think you get maybe just in music reporting that you don't have in politics reporting. And I just find that so funny because there's so much interplay between music and politics. And in the work that I do, I see so much instrumentalization of music, the music industry, musical artists for political purposes. And yet political beat reporters kind of profess to be the creme de la creme of, independent journalism, and it's anything but.
Well, let's talk about your story, because you just did a couple of Joe Rogan interviews that were very provocative. So originally you started as a corporate lawyer.
Yeah.
Okay, and you were actually representing tech companies.
Tech companies, financial firms, private equity, mergers and acquisitions, corporate governance, a pretty wide range for about 8 years. And then I got bit by the internet bug. There's always, I guess, a side of me that was, I sort of grew up in an internet family and always kind of had this more artistic side that, let's just say being a corporate lawyer doesn't scratch the itch. And then when I saw what was happening to the internet in 2016 with the onset of social media censorship, I just dedicated my whole life to trying to understand the forces behind it. And that took me into a career in the White House and in diplomacy and into the wider cinematic universe of global power structures, I guess.
Okay, so you started writing online about internet censorship, and that ultimately got you into the White House.
Yeah, I was doing a lot of private briefings. At the time, people didn't really understand what was going on. Everybody was looking at Mark Zuckerberg or Susan Wojcicki at YouTube and saying, they're the ones censoring me. And I would give these private briefings because I just compiled so much research on the topic. And the first slide was what everyone thinks censorship is. And it's, a little person looking up at a boot, and it's got Mark Zuckerberg's face looking down, putting the boot on your neck. And then the second slide in this presentation, this was like a 6-hour, 190 slide presentation is a stock thing. The second slide was what censorship actually looks like. And it's Mark Zuckerberg is the little person looking up at a boot, and it is the blob. It is the foreign policy establishment and national security state putting their boot on Mark Zuckerberg's neck to put its boot on yours. And I think that framework was not understood at all from 2016 to 2020. It took Trump getting kicked off social media. It took a lot of things that started to change between 2020 and 2022 for that message to really begin to take off. And now I think almost everyone who pays attention to the issue understands this is actually how things operate.
Okay, so let's talk about how you got into the White House, because originally you worked for Ben Carson.
Yeah.
So how did that happen?
Well, I'd done some real estate work as well. And at the time, Secretary Carson was working on kind of tech innovation in low-cost housing and economic development and regional development. And so I started working with Secretary Carson, who's an amazing guy. And at the same time, I continued networking and briefing folks around the White House. And so it was a kind of natural evolution to go in and take over that portfolio for White House speechwriting. It's kind of funny, though, because when I got to the White House, I don't think the White House really appreciated the size of the threat. At the time, I think Trump was running on re-election mostly on economic grounds, and he was calling MAGA Microsoft, Apple, Google, and Amazon. So I was writing speeches about social media censorship, and the response right up until close to the 2020 election, when it started to really affect the White House personally, was to kind of disregard that, because I don't think they wanted the dogfight with the big tech companies unless they absolutely had to, and then it was too late.
Okay, so like you said, you're working for Ben Carson, who at the time was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development.
Yeah.
And that somehow got you to become a speechwriter for Donald Trump himself.
Yeah.
So were you actually talking personally with Trump during this time?
No, but there's a lot of intermingling between the agencies. There's a lot of, it's a cabinet level position for Secretary Carson. And what I was doing was I was networking while I was at HUD, the same way I was networking while I was in New York City, giving these private briefings, doing these presentations, putting out my research to policymakers. And that began to make an impact behind the scenes. So they brought me into the White House.
Okay. And what type of things were you writing into Trump's speeches exactly?
Well, this was what was really funny. There was one in the summer of 2020 where we brought together these state attorney generals, I think like 26 or 27 states, around taking on big tech abuses. And it was kind of consumer protection, Federal Trade Commission, FTC type stuff, and then also social media censorship weaponization by these companies. And I remember I wrote that speech, and Trump looks down at it because when he's seated, he does teleprompter when he's standing, but when he's seated, he has a printout. And this was like my magnum opus. I thought that basically like years of work were channeled into this. I had all the players, I had all the history, I had the network, I had all the statistics. And Trump looks down at this. This is about June 2020. He goes, everyone always talks about censorship like it's a big deal. Let them censor all they want. They can't stop me. They tried to stop me before. And, at the time I had a little bit of hair at that point left. And I think that was when I lost the last of it. It was a dogfight even to get censorship on the menu for that speech because the state attorney generals were skittish about losing their consensus with the Democrats for their 50-state coalition taking on big tech on antitrust grounds. So they said, can we leave the censorship out of the censorship talk? And I said, no way. And then, Trump, that's part of the magic of Trump. Is that it's almost like a fortune cookie. You never know, as a speechwriter for Trump, what you're going to get. And honestly, that's what makes his authenticity so visceral. It's very real. Even as a speech, he doesn't follow the script. It's almost like when you nail it as a speechwriter for him, it's kind of an honor for him to read what's on the page, because he would only do that if it's perfectly 100% consistent with his vision and way of seeing the world. But in that case, I thought it was a strategic mistake that the White House didn't realize until way too late about the forces they were up against.
Well, you said right around late 2017, things changed in terms of searching. There was the Trust Project, and then there was Google's OWL project.
Yeah.
Where instead of independent news being pinned to the top, the big media outlets would automatically be pinned to the top of these search results. So explain that.
Yeah. So what Google did after the 2016 election was they initiated this Project OWL, this authoritative sources re-ranking mechanism for Google and YouTube, in order to end the democratization, effectively, the fair fight, the neutral search term dogfight that happens when you are searching by a keyword. So everything works. Google is monetized through essentially words. Companies bid on words for Google Ads. That's the lion's share of the revenue. And before early 2017, the way it would work is what's on the top of Google were things like how frequently are you cited by other sources. So you could have a blog from a totally random no-name website that's number one on Google because it's just a really well-written article that is referenced so many times by so many other websites. It's got a certain length, so time on page, so Google can run, ads and sponsored content, on that as well. And so it was a kind of fair fight on the internet before that. But what happened is 2016 was this year of kind of unprecedented political turbulence in the post-Cold War history of America. The Brexit referendum happened in the summer of 2016, which was something that was powered by basically little people on the internet against big media, big government, big industry. You had the election of Donald Trump in 2016, which, this is basically the twin towers falling of political events. This is the UK and US, the transatlantic hegemons of Western power. Both of their effectively governance structures were completely reorganized simply because of free speech on the internet. And all of, I use this term, the blob. It's not my term. This was Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes's term to describe this immovable, unstoppable force within Washington, which appeared to have more power than the White House itself. This was Obama's White House, which would use this term. It comes from that 1950s movie about this kind of, alien purple blob that just absorbs everything in its path. And it represents these kind of permanent Washington, D.C. creatures, this kind of donor, drafter, financial, multinational corporation overclass, and the spawn of NGOs and trade associations and civil society groups underneath it. But all of their interests were considered badly threatened by free speech on the internet, having the ability to circumvent mainstream media as a gatekeeper for ascendancy in politics. You really only had a Coke and Pepsi choice before this. Trump didn't just defeat Hillary Clinton in 2016. He defeated Jeb Bush. He took down the dynasties on both sides of the aisle. And this was something that was spreading around the world very, very fast. You had Bolsonaro in Brazil who came to power. They called him the Trump of the tropics. Again, hated by mainstream media in Brazil, hated by Globo, the biggest media platform in Brazil. You had Marine Le Pen rising in France. You had the AfD party rising in Germany, the Vox party in Spain, the Brexit movement in the UK, the Five Star movement in Italy. You had the Philippines election going the wrong way because of Facebook. And so all around the world, you had this banking class, this Chamber of Commerce, multinational corporation class, having their interests being badly damaged by essentially people who were popular on social media rising to political power. And so what they did, the blob, this set of institutional players, is they got Google in the room, they got Facebook in the room, they got Twitter 1.0 in the room with Jack Dorsey, and they basically threatened the government's relationship, the favors for favors relationship between government and business, and said, if you don't make these changes to your terms of service, if you don't make these changes to your content moderation policy, then you're not going to get favors with us anymore. And it was a business decision. If you remember, Jack Dorsey said the reason they took Trump off Twitter was because it was a business decision. Jack Dorsey just endorsed Thomas Massey for president, a Republican libertarian. He at one point called Twitter the free speech wing of the free speech party. And Mark Zuckerberg didn't want to do it either. All the emails that have come out of the Jim Jordan Weaponization Committee show Zuckerberg fighting with his own staff about whether they really have to go through with this. And he's told by his head of global affairs that we have bigger fish to fry with the Biden administration. And so we need to think creatively about how to be receptive to their takedown demands around COVID censorship and the like, because we are dependent on them on multiple policy fronts. And I can send you all these receipts you can put on screen.
Well, let me push back on this one a little bit, because I have a computer science degree, and I was around when the first search engines were, being formed and so forth. So I know a little bit about this. My company is primarily based on YouTube, which is a Google company. And I can tell you that when it comes to the Google search algorithm, nobody knows exactly what it does. This is such a complex beast that relies on so many thousands, if not millions of different factors in order to bring someone to something they're actually searching for. I wouldn't say it's as simple as saying, well, we just switched it and suddenly it works this way or another way. Because at the end of the day, when you put out content and it really is strong content, it generally does go to the top.
No, I can play you a 10-hour supercut of Google executives talking about the authoritative news re-ranking system they implemented in 2017. It's all very public. I can literally show you conferences from May 2017 where Google is telling CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy that they are doing this for this purpose, to stop populist movements who amplify their political campaigns on Google and YouTube for that purpose. And that's not to say that there isn't competition. You don't have a video necessarily super glued from one particular source, but what you have is a whitelist, blacklist, graylist type system. This is sort of like what Wikipedia does, where Wikipedia has a reliable sources threshold for being able to actually have it be entered into a Wikipedia entry. And what you'll see is that there's basically no, for example, Trump supporting right-wing sources that are allowed to be cited on Wikipedia. Breitbart is not allowed to be cited. OAN is not allowed to be cited. Gateway Pundit is not allowed to be cited. Daily Wire, Federalist. You'll never see a Wikipedia article with all these different. Even Fox News is not allowed to be cited. And it's not just a partisan political thing. You got left-wing outlets that are populist, so they're sort of NATO skeptical, blob skeptical from the left-wing perspective, like the Gray Zone, that are also banned. So they're just hard blacklisted, even if they've got the best evidence on a particular thing. But then what you have is this kind of squishy whitelist, graylist thing in the middle, where the authoritative news will say, if you are CNN, if you are the New York Times, if you are the Wall Street Journal, if you are the Washington Post, you are whitelisted. So you are going to automatically have a much better chance to appear in the algorithm, regardless of the quality of the reporting on that topic, than anything in the graylist or blacklist area. The blacklist area won't even appear. And you can even go back into the Wayback Machine and you can look at search terms for the exact same search terms. Just go to archive.org and just put in from late 2017 and late 2016 for any politically sensitive topic. And you'll see exactly what I'm talking about here. So there is a sort of democracy within authorized sources that happens. But even then, they began to play a lot of games. They use something called the redirect method, so that when you search for certain terms, you're automatically prone to see something unrelated, tangential to what you were looking for, but not what the algorithm would have organically selected as the top 10 results. And this was all very deliberate.
Well, look, I can't tell you, after COVID hit, I had a guest that was pushing back on the vaccine and so forth. And it wasn't that I was pushing this agenda. I was actually arguing back. And this video ended up getting hit with a community guideline strike. And at that point, I was like, okay, well, I'm not trying to have my channel go down. So it just scared the shit out of me. So I just stopped any sort of COVID conversations on my channel after that.
Susan Wojcicki said, what was it, 100 million videos they blacklisted or algorithmically throttled that talked about COVID-19. I think it was 100 million was the number. It was a total blanket ban on anything that contradicted any element of the COVID narrative. COVID origins, COVID vaccines, COVID mask efficacy, COVID lockdowns, COVID mandates, the whole thing. And Google, by the way, these YouTube services are a funnel for a lot of other Google investments. Google is very deeply co-invested in the vaccine space. Google is an addendum in many respects of the U.S. government. I mean, it's useful in this context to understand where Google came from. Google was started at Stanford by Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who were getting their Stanford PhD on a DARPA grant for a joint CIA-NSA project called the Massive Digital Data System Program, which was a CIA-NSA program to track how birds of a feather flock together in Web 1.0 static web page search. This is as the internet started as a military project. ARPA, DARPA, made civilian use by the National Science Foundation, and then rolled out to the World Wide Web in 1990. And in that period, you had all these different foreign countries who were searching the internet for things. And the CIA and NSA believed that search results could be useful to, if they could have a systematic way of understanding search queries in foreign countries, that it could serve as a early warning political radar system in order to track the rise and fall of popularity of various political movements. And that would allow intelligence and statecraft to interface and potentially amplify or subvert those movements. And that's how Google started. Google became a military contractor. The first year it went public in the early 2000s. Google only has Google Maps because they bought Keyhole from the Central Intelligence Agency. Google has been this way from cradle to grave. Google will always be what Julian Assange called a shadow State Department. And you can read Julian Assange's article called "Google is Not What It Seems." And this gets to how we even got, how did these content moderation policies start changing at Google in 2016? A lot of this came from this Jared Cohen nexus, who was a State Department policy planning staff guy who was instrumental in the Arab Spring and taught the State Department how to use social media for regime change operations to cultivate mass movement destabilization campaigns, because social media could galvanize crowds way faster than and way more cheaply and at scale than running these CIA operations out of U.S. embassies or consulates or CIA station houses. And where did Jared Cohen go after being the State Department and CIA's whiz kid for starting color revolutions? He went straight to Google. And when Google wasn't even in the top 100 companies, right on the eve of the Arab Spring, which he's credited for in many ways because these were social media revolutions that followed his blueprint, and he worked intimately with the groups on the ground. And then he goes straight to Google. He becomes Eric Schmidt, the CEO's right-hand man. And I've seen Google company emails from my sources with Jared Cohen very diligently tracking the 2016 election as Trump was gaining in the polls and talking with Eric Schmidt about it. And then what happens there? Then they rebrand his one-person think tank at Google, which was called Google Ideas. It changes its name to Jigsaw. And then they train what was essentially the world's first retail artificial intelligence-based censorship application. It was called Perspective. Anyone can go to Google right now and look up Perspective API from Google Jigsaw. The first three things it was trained on were the 2016 presidential election, the Brexit vote, and then climate change was the third one. But it was intensely focused on content moderation, censorship of political populist movements in the U.S. and U.K. at the time, and now it's all over the world, and nuking hundreds of millions of posts, comments. This thing was licensed to comment sections so that you could, just turn down the volume on any keyword or phrase associated with a dissident thought. And this was an addendum of Google.
Well, there has to be a balancing point. So, for example, when COVID first hit, you had celebrities who had big online followings like Carrie Hilson that was saying that 5G causes COVID, right? And people were actually running with that and really believing it. Like, if you let these things run rampant, people are going to start tearing down cell phone towers and all types of other crazy stuff because this is becoming amplified to the top. And as you know, conspiracy theory is always a lot more popular than something that might be kind of boring in the news. So how do you really balance these things?
Well, that's why God invented the criminal justice system. You tear down a 5G tower and you go to prison, federal prison for 30 years. That sets a pretty strong example. We didn't have an epidemic of people tearing down 5G towers, even though that, that talk was out there. Even if it was censored on YouTube, you could still see that on static blogs and independent web pages and word of mouth. And even then, what you get is even more fringe characters who believe they're onto some secret knowledge because it must be true because the government is banning you from saying it.
Right.
And that almost makes it seem more true. I actually think that when you allow conspiracy theories to play out in the marketplace of ideas, although it may be a little bit terrifying to the powers that be that they can gain some initial traction, what you find is that people's reputations really get crushed when they go out on a limb on something that's wrong and it's borne out over time. They lose trust, they lose followership. If they're entertaining, they may have some residual base or keep a certain amount. But generally speaking, people, if you're really wrong on something, you pay for that as a content creator down the line. But the fact is when you, this is kind of one of the things that backfires about censorship. There's what's the quote? Never believe anything until it's officially denied. And there is an element of that, which is that if something is considered such a danger to the U.S. State Department, to the U.S. military, to these multinational corporations, that your belief in it and sharing it with a friend is you align enough powerful forces next to each other against some simple sentence I want to say to a buddy. And I go, well, wait, why don't you want me to say that? What's really going on here? And I think that when you get in the business of the government putting its boot down on the throat of a private company to throttle billions of people around the world with what they can and can't say, that becomes very quickly abused. And it was. And now basically every sensitive topic has I could talk about the JFK assassination, climate change, the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, and you will see on YouTube an interstitial that will link you straight to the Wikipedia, and which is another rabbit hole of the forces around Wikipedia. But the fact is it's a dangerous game, and it sort of subverts what we consider to be the legitimacy of democracy, which is that we get to vote on politicians based on what we know or what we can look up or do our own research about those politicians. If an entrenched class of politicians and their surrounding corporate and stakeholder interests can stop us from learning information, then we don't even know what we're voting on. We get back to this Coke and Pepsi.
Well, 2020, you ended up serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Communications and Information Policy in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs in the U.S. State Department. Quite a mouthful there. So describe to me what exactly that role is about.
So that's considered the cyber portfolio for economic diplomacy. And what that really is there's three levels to it. You can think of so just getting back to this kind of structure of the blob, you have diplomacy, defense, and intelligence as kind of our national security state. Defense or war, the Department of War now, is our military and national security interests. You have our economic interests, so we call that national interest, whereas the military is national security. And that is related to things that make our country more economically prosperous. So U.S. companies getting deals abroad. We would prefer to have, for example, if the world's largest copper mine is discovered in Angola, it helps U.S. GDP, our economy, if an American company, an American metals and mining company, gets access to that copper mine rather than China or Russia. In the tech space, there is this same economic warfare and competition that plays out between what are called the national champions of every country. So, for example, Microsoft is a big tech national champion. Google is a big tech national champion. If Google gets kicked out of Europe or Africa or Asia, and TikTok, a well, globally China-owned company takes over the market share, well, there goes all the ability for the U.S. government to use that as a vector for soft power influence. There goes all of the downstream economic trickle-down effects in terms of creating American jobs, allowing Americans to have a pension and buy homes and pay for college. There goes all the economic development. And so there's this relationship of favors for favors that plays out between the U.S. diplomatic function at the State Department to essentially broker deals, juice the skids, push for regulation or trade policy. For example, one of the things that I dealt with while I was at the State Department running that bureau was Google lobbyists that called me and wanted favors essentially around the State Department in our upcoming negotiations with Europe around something called the Digital Markets and Digital Services Act. This was a budding piece of new legislation in Europe that threatened Google's data monopolies. Europe has very strict, they've got something like the GDPR, and they also, foreign countries don't love that Google takes up the ad revenue for media organizations in their country. For example, like Australia tried to pass something to make, and Canada tried this too, to try to get Google to have to pay essentially like a share of the advertising revenue that used to go directly to the New York Times, when you would have to go to the New York Times webpage. And instead, when it goes to Google, this happens at the local level too. And the only thing that can stop those governments from passing laws that hurt Google's profits are Google leaving its economic footprint there, or the U.S. government in its diplomatic envoys telling that government, oh, you better not do that, or we're going to tariff you. We're going to leave this security arrangement. We're going to sanction you. We're going to do retaliatory regulatory structures here. And so the State Department is essentially the big daddy muscle that juices the skids for the big tech companies. And there's a revolving door. The guy before me, for example, at my seat at State, went directly from there to work for the Umbrella Trade and Lobbying Association for Google and Microsoft and Apple. And you make a lot more money as a lobbyist that way than you do when you're actually sitting in the chair. And so it creates this kind of incentive structure where the government official sitting in the diplomacy chair does favors for big business. Big business rewards that government official when he leaves the government with board seats or think tank sinecures or fellowships at NGOs, or hires you as a lobbyist so that you can work with your old friends who are still in government to get them to do what the companies want.
Well, January 6, 2021, the Capitol attack happens. Are you still in government when this happens?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was a crazy week.
I bet.
Because, and this was a funny thing. On that call with Google, I brought, because that was when Trump got nuked. Trump got nuked on Twitter that week, Facebook, everywhere. I mean, they took him out Alex Jones style. They took out his MailChimp. They took out his merch store. He was unpersoned as the sitting president of the United States. And I remember in my call with these 9 Google lobbyists that week, and these were Google lobbyists who were former lobbyists for foreign governments and big oil companies. Now they were all Google lobbyists. And I mentioned, you want the U.S. government to change our negotiating strategy with Europe to do favors for Google's profits, while Google and YouTube are severing my boss, Donald. You want the Trump State Department to go out of its way to do favors for Google, while Google and YouTube are effectively blanket banning Donald Trump. How does this make sense? I mean, it only makes sense if you presume that the State Department officials are going to backstab their boss in order to serve a private company in its global markets. And this was, by and large, what the State Department officials were doing up and down the chain throughout the first Trump term. And I think this is what has put kind of gasoline to the fire of Trump's focus on things like USAID and massively restructuring the State Department. They laid off 4,000 State Department employees about 2 months ago because this is a very, very powerful weapon. And it gets to the heart of the music industry, too. Who's the head of Google and YouTube Music? It's Leo Cohen.
Okay, I know Leo Cohen personally. So,
well,
you mean
I'm not.
hold on.
Go
So
ahead.
you mean to tell me that Leo Cohen is somehow in bed with the State Department in terms of what exactly?
Well, literally, yeah. Go ahead, put it on screen. Look up the State Department Global Music Diplomacy Program. It was jointly announced by Leo Cohen and Secretary of State Tony Blinken. This is a formal U.S. State Department program to give preference to State Department hand-picked rappers, hip-hop artists, country musicians, every genre of music. And this taps into what has been going on for about a century, but it's been put on steroids in the past decade with this concept of music diplomacy, hip-hop diplomacy. Started off way back with jazz diplomacy, but there is this relationship between the music industry, big labels, big distribution platforms, and U.S. and British statecraft, where there is this kind of mutually reinforcing circle of economic interests, government policies, and preferred distribution given to artists to serve the various needs of those stakeholders. And so I do find it, just because this is kind of up your alley. And by the way, I'm not taking shots at Leo Cohen when I say that. I'm simply trying to describe how these power structures work. You can make the argument that this advances U.S. national interests because if the U.S. State Department sets some policy goal that we want a certain movement to rise to power in Nigeria, because that will redound to the financial interests of ExxonMobil and Chevron and our transatlantic partners, the UK, Shell, and British Petroleum. These all have massive interests in the oil in Nigeria. And you look at how the State Department is so deeply involved in the music scene in Nigeria. So is UMG and Lucian Grange. And so is the YouTube State Department music diplomacy program there. You can make an argument that by seeding these rap collectives and these hip-hop communities and speaking to Nigerian youth and doing this youth engagement and civil society mobilization around all the different corruption issues there paves the way for deals and contracts for U.S. companies and then makes America richer. America has been this way since the beginning. We got our global empire because of United Fruit, essentially. When we were doing big oil, we were doing big sugar and big ag, multinational corporation and government interests fused. Then it was big oil, and now it's big tech, but it's also big music.
Well, okay, because you've claimed that USAID is training pop stars like Dua Lipa to destabilize governments.
No, I never claimed that USAID is training her. We can talk about the Dua Lipa example specifically. So the Dua Lipa thing is kind of a funny one. And this is something that it's a little bit easier to start with the things that are sourced top to bottom with how the whole mechanism works. But I can answer it directly by saying that what came to my attention, because I like Dua Lipa. I listen to all this music. Dua Lipa, has this, Kosovo, Serbian, this Yugoslavia, Balkans footprint heritage. And this was a major base of operations for post-Cold War activities of NATO. NATO was formed in 1949 never fired a bullet until 1995 over Yugoslavia, and the CIA, State Department, U.S. military, U.S. government-funded NGOs were the boots on the ground for the Otpor movement that toppled the government of Slobodan Milosevic. And right now, the U.S. State Department is having a lot of issues with Serbia and Kosovo, potentially slipping out of their post-Cold War grasp because of a perceived tilt towards Russian influence. And there is activation. There's hundreds of millions of U.S. aid money that is going into trying to win the hearts and minds of the people in Kosovo and the people in Serbia to try to bring them deeper into the Euro-Atlantic orbit rather than the Russian one. And so one of the things that came to my attention is I've done many hundreds of hours of streams, deep dives, publications on a group called the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is NATO's think tank. It is funded by the U.S. military, the U.S. State Department, USAID, USAID, CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy, 11 different U.S. government agencies every year. Our taxpayers pay those government agencies so they can pay the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council, as we speak, has 7 former number 1 heads of the Central Intelligence Agency on their board of directors. 7 of them. I say it's a lot, but a lot of people don't even know that 7 number 1 heads of the CIA are still alive, let alone locally clustered on the board of directors of a single entity that I believe in 2022-ish gave Dua Lipa their Distinguished Leadership Award. Now, why would an entity with 7 CIA directors on its board that is funded by the U.S. military, the U.S. State Department, a bunch of CIA cutouts, as well as a bunch of military contractors like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, and energy companies like Shell, British Petroleum, ExxonMobil, Chevron, why would they give their Distinguished Leadership Award to Dua Lipa? Well, Dua Lipa has been campaigning against the very enemies of the U.S. State Department through her public messaging on the ground. What she posts on Instagram about Kosovo and Serbia is exactly what the State Department is pushing to try to get rule of law reforms and to try to get these corruption charges on Serbian officials and networks in Kosovo that are targeted in USAID corruption programs and State Department corruption, anti-corruption programs. This is a soft power node. The bigger the megaphone Dua Lipa gets to shout that message, the more the U.S. State Department and its associated multinational corporations and private investment funds get a grip over Serbia and Kosovo. And this is a relationship that it's not unique to Dua Lipa in any sense. And by the way, I have no idea how clued into it Dua Lipa is, or whether she even knows what the Atlantic Council is in any meaningful sense. When she got on the stage, and you can go to YouTube and you can just type in Atlantic Council Dua Lipa, and you'll see this. When she got that, I don't know if her manager or her label or any of the other forces, I don't know what links in the chain were apprised or not apprised in the Dua Lipa case study, but there are many others that we can talk about, because many times this is unwitting. And this is, for example, like the Taylor Swift example that the media did not like me publishing about. The Taylor Swift example, should I continue here? Or, because the Taylor Swift NATO involvement that I broke was sort of misreported by Fox News. And so it wasn't really reported with the accuracy that I reported it when it hit the mainstream. I don't know, this was probably a year and a half ago or so. I was doing a private stream for my subscribers on X about the origins of NATO's control over social media, because the Atlantic Council, for example, is one of the trusted flaggers for Facebook and for YouTube and for Twitter 1.0. And so the same group that's giving out Dua Lipa an award and trying to amplify her messaging about, essentially geopolitics in the Balkans is deciding whether or not my speech about what's happening in Ukraine is allowed on YouTube, or it will be recommended in a search algorithm, or will be, shadow banned on Facebook. I find that to be very deeply troubling. I don't like having the Central Intelligence Agency or the U.S. military determining whether or not people see my messages about something that's First Amendment protected speech. But so I was going through a video from the summer of 2019 on NATO's Psychological Operations Center. It's called NATO Stratcom COE, Strategic Communications, a Stratcom. They have a center of excellence they set up in Riga, Latvia, after the disaster in Crimea in 2014. The U.S. military and NATO believe that the reason that they lost Crimea to the Russian Federation in that vote that was done that effectively annexed them as part of the Russian Federation was because Russian media, Russian telegram channels, Russian influence on social media was prying hearts and minds towards the Russians, and U.S. aid programming wasn't enough to overcome that, nor was support for independent media on the ground. And so they got in the censorship business to lean on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter to turn down the voices of pro-Russian voices within Central and Eastern Europe. And so I was showing these presentations on NATO's YouTube page. And within that, there was a presentation by 3 folks presenting to a bunch of military officials techniques for being able to use AI for content moderation by having AI leverage keywords and slogans for various political movements in Central and Eastern Europe to be able to turn down the voices of the military's political opponents in Central and Eastern Europe and turn up their own. All 3 of the presenters in this presentation had intelligence links. One of them started her career in the Central Intelligence Agency. Another one worked for the 77th Military Intelligence Brigade for the UK. And the third one worked for a company called Graphica, which is a CIA contractor that's gotten over $7 million in Pentagon grants to do social media network analysis for the U.S. State Department, intelligence, and military to be able to track what different groups around the world are saying on social media. And she presents how NATO can win the hearts and minds information war so that Central and Eastern European countries will fall back closer to the U.S.-UK way of seeing the world rather than the Russian way of seeing the world. And she puts up a picture of Taylor Swift on screen. It's in 2019, and talks about how Taylor Swift is an example of someone who could be, quote, trained to spread desired messaging. And I can send you the receipts on this. You can play the clip, or you can put the receipt right here on screen.
So the first one, that's the most famous and the most common, is working with famous people or main influencers to share information or a particular message. So I include Taylor Swift in here because...
Are you fucking kidding me? NATO's Psychological Operations Unit. It's on the screen. Center of Excellence, the NATO Center of Excellence in 2019. Taylor fucking Swift, who I probably rage posted about 1,400 times about as a geopolitical instrument of statecraft because her goddamn IP discography was purchased by the fucking Carlyle Group. The Carlyle Group, the private equity arm of the Iraq War, with Dick Cheney on its board and the entire Halliburton, West Texas oil mafia. They were the literal funders and profiteers of the entire West Texas military mafia, and it was jointly bought by the Carlyle Group and the Soros Group, who's the London and New York financier class of West Texas. So the fucking military-industrial complex, plus its energy stakeholders who rely on the battering ram of the Pentagon, the State Department, the CIA, but Taylor Swift's discography. She had to re-record her own shit last year in order to win her right, in order to have a parallel tracks to win back her own rights.
Now, I published that, and she talks about how Taylor Swift had previously worked with the U.S. government on get out the vote drives and public health initiatives, and how empirical studies in academic literature and foreign policy journals showed that Taylor Swift could be an effective weapon for shifting elections. This is why coming into the 2024 election, you saw mainstream media reporting saying Taylor Swift might be the secret weapon. This is why the EU, the head of the European Union, called for Taylor Swift to extend her Eras tour to do do campaign or concert tours for the Eras tour all over Europe ahead of the EU elections. This was because Taylor Swift was effectively associated with a kind of anti-Trump, anti-populist messaging. And there's empirical evidence, according to their own scientific academic journals, about when she says, go to the polls and vote, to the youth demographic. And the youth demographic is disproportionately likely to oppose a Trump-style figure in the European Union. This is very useful to NATO, which is kind of the military arm of the EU. And this is very useful to the transatlantic foreign policy establishment. And so you have these musicians caught in the middle of these proxy wars between populist and establishment political forces. Now, what got misreported in that story after I broke it, because this video got millions of hits and everyone was talking about this, Jesse Waters at Fox News emailed me for me to come on and present this all on Fox, but I had a prior engagement. So he reported this story, but he sort of mischaracterized a lot of the details and made it sound like I had said, actually, he didn't even cite me. He kind of took credit for it, frankly, after finding it from me and then asking me to come on the show. And when I couldn't come on, he sort of presented it like it was his own. Not trying to throw shade, Jesse, but if you see this, you should, make things right. But the point is, Jesse sort of made it sound like that was proof that Taylor was working directly with NATO or that they had some agreement in the background. I have no idea whether or not they did or didn't. It wouldn't surprise me if there were communications. I don't think Taylor would be apprised of that directly. You don't want to compromise artist integrity. This is much better to come from the label level. You're gonna do this concert, and hey, it's gonna be in Bratislava. Why are we going to Bratislava? Oh, it's an emerging market, and blah blah blah. And it's better to just do your song and dance and be authentic and true in your music. Artists don't want to feel like they're being instrumentalized like that, especially big artists. And this is something that a lot of these music diplomacy program nodes talk about, which is that it's actually easier to get smaller and mid-career artists to spread the desired messaging for a number of reasons, which we can get to. But what I'm saying is that can come from the manager level. That can come from the venue level. That can come from how the streaming platform and distribution on the local radios or popular streaming platforms in the country play out. That doesn't have to. You're not going to have like some smoky back room where Taylor Swift is meeting directly with a 4-star military general, to plot how this concert in Minsk we're going to drop some coded backwards Beatles, track with secret language telling people to vote for a certain person. But there are examples where it does get quite close to that line. These are you look at the programs that are happening in Africa or in Cuba. The Cuba example is a very naked one, where you have these U.S. aid programs that directly pay rap collectives. This is if you look at Creative Associates International and the scandal there around cultivating the hip hop community in Cuba, You had the San Ysidro movement working directly with the U.S. State Department, directly with USAID, also getting them international play, even though they're just a local rap collective. And this is effectively a CIA-style operation to try to do youth engagement, popular mobilization to overthrow the government of Cuba, because the population disproportionately listens to what was essentially Afro-Cuban hip-hop. You have CIA cutouts who would openly say this. You can look up the Journal of Democracy, National Endowment for Democracy write-up on how the populations they wanted to mobilize in these Cuba protest movements disproportionately listen to rap music and had these different demographic attributes that lent towards it. And then you saw millions of dollars to pump that up. You see the same thing. This happened in Bangladesh just last year in 2024. The National Endowment for Democracy, which played a big role in the Cuba rap movement and funding those Cuban rap collectives, did the same thing. That was in 2014 under Obama, 2009 to 2014. But just last year in Bangladesh, the prime minister was toppled in a people-powered revolution by street protests and riots. And you can look up all the leaked documents that came out from the International Republican Institute, which is the Republican arm of the National Endowment for Democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy is the pure CIA cutout in the entire arsenal. It was conceived by the Central Intelligence Agency Director William Casey in the early 1980s. I can put the receipts on screen next to me as I say it, as I can show you William Casey, the CIA director, telling the Reagan administration in the 1980s that this Project Democracy, this National Endowment for Democracy, should be set up to fund the groups that the CIA wants to fund, but it would be too scandalous if they did. But the CIA should not be seen as advocating for this or sponsoring this. This is the CIA director saying, do this, but don't tell anybody that the CIA is behind this. The legislation for the bill that created the National Endowment for Democracy came from Walter Raymond, who was 30 years at the CIA. He was William Casey's right-hand man. He was in charge of propaganda for the Central Intelligence Agency. And the founders of the National Endowment for Democracy told the New York Times and Washington Post in the 1980s that they were set up to fund the groups that the CIA used to fund in the 1960s and 70s, but got in trouble when it came out they got CIA funding, and that they do now what the CIA used to do. In 1986, I believe it was the New York Times, the Washington Post published that the CIA gets a copy of every single grant that the National Endowment for Democracy gives. So you have the CIA openly saying they created the National Endowment for Democracy. You have the National Endowment for Democracy saying that they do what the CIA wants to do. You have the CIA getting a copy of every single one of their grants. Well, what was the National Endowment for Democracy doing in Bangladesh? They were funding and training rap groups to sow messages of distrust and anger at the Bangladeshi government, who is at war with the Biden State Department over a whole range of issues. And the IRI, the Republican branch of the National Endowment for Democracy, has correspondence. And I can send you all of these. They're baseline assessments for how to swing the next election in Bangladesh, how to destabilize the country. Includes all of their grants to rap and hip hop groups, including working with them to produce music videos. And you can play these on screen next to me. These State Department CIA produced rap videos with lyrics telling people to take to the streets and how the government is abusing them. We need to get them out. And it's the same story time and time again. This is what our programs in Nigeria and Uganda, this is what our programs during the Arab Spring were doing from 2009 to 2012. This is what our programs in Venezuela were doing, our programs in Cuba. This is a global thing, and the money is juiced by millions of dollars in direct grants, tens of millions of dollars, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars on net through sub-grants and contractors at every level of the chain, from artist cultivation, workshops, festivals, concert series, songwriting forums. Here's a great one. The State Department Music Diplomacy Program brought 22 rappers and hip-hop artists last year to the State Department for training at the State Department, and then trips to New York City and to UNC Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is a big military vector, for workshops on how to mobilize street protests and how to do youth engagement and how to infuse your lyrics with pro-democracy messaging that's synchronized with the State Department activities in the region. There's another one of these State Department music diplomacy programs. It's called AMMP. It's the American Music Mentoring Program. And what it does is it brings all of these local and developing, I think they call them mid-career music professionals. And this is not just the artists themselves, the singers, the songwriters, the musicians, but entertainment lawyers, executives at labels, producers, talent scouts, A&R people, brings them to the United States to meet with the State Department and the Recording Academy, which is an arm of the Grammy Awards. This is the entire Grammy Awards network, so that they are assigned a mentor, a handler. These are artists in the global music scene from all across the world to come to the United States on taxpayer dime to work with our State Department, who not just does the overt diplomacy, but all the covert soft power influence and CIA underside, to get personally trained in each of their fields, to be assigned a mentor from the U.S. State Department and effectively the Grammys network, the most credentialed, deepest roster of the biggest insiders in the music industry, so that the entertainment lawyers and the talent scouts and the sound engineers and the entire chain for distribution in Nigeria or in Haiti is assigned their handler in the United States. And then not only do they meet with them for this multi-week, grooming session effectively, but then afterwards they have virtual conferences throughout the year on their joint projects, the initiatives they're doing in their country, so that the State Department can work with them to develop their little influence node in their own country. And then USAID will juice the skids by, essentially working with the radio stations or the all the different distribution. This is part of how, part of how the industry works.
Well, by 2021, you left government, primarily because Trump was out of office, I assume?
Yeah, I was a political appointee, so.
Got it. Okay, so then you go independent and you start focusing on what you call the censorship industrial complex. Describe what that is.
The censorship industrial complex is the network of institutions across 4 categories of institutions that all work together in order to synchronize censorship of disfavored narratives or political movements around the world. And there's 4 categories of institutions that move in what they call a whole of society method. There's government institutions. This is a place like the State Department, Defense Department. If they're trying to censor COVID, it'll be something like HHS or NIH or FDA. So there's the government institutions. There's the private sector institutions. So these are the multinational corporations, but they're also for-profit companies that specialize in countering disinformation or tracking narrative movements spread online. Places like NewsGuard or the Global Disinformation Index or the like. Then the third category is civil society institutions. So this is everything from NGOs, foundations, university centers, trade associations, community and movement leaders, representatives of voices of different demographic or religious or ethnic or gender groups in the nonprofit space. And then the fourth is media institutions. So this is not my concept. I can play you a supercut of everyone in the censorship industrial complex invoking this term whole of society, like it's this incantation, apologizing to each other after enough years because they're all so sick of hearing countering disinformation requires a whole of society approach. And this is because each of those nodes, the government, the corporations, the nonprofits and civil society organizations and media organizations, all have different levers that they can pull and different restrictions on what they can and can't do. So, for example, in the United States, we have a First Amendment. The government can't put its finger on the gun and fire the bullet that kills my ability to say I disagree with U.S. foreign policy on Ukraine, or I disagree with vaccine efficacy statistics put out by the NIH.
Well, hold on a second. So what exactly happened with Jimmy Kimmel and that whole situation?
Well, what happened there is first of all, some of the facts are disputed there on the ground. The allegation is that something called jawboning occurred, which is a gray area insofar as there is always the ability to talk with producers of media about responding to a story or the like. And there are sometimes so jawboning is this idea that you are not telling someone you can't do this, but you are essentially insinuating that you will lose favor with the federal government, or the federal government won't do something for you if you don't do this thing for me. And so I believe what was at issue there was an allegation around essentially, FCC licenses or merger approvals for Kimmel after he told a lie about Charlie Kirk's murder, saying that he was one of the MAGA people. Essentially insinuating that a MAGA person had shot Charlie Kirk rather than someone in FBI custody right now who's alleged to be kind of affiliated with Antifa networks, and the opposite. Right now, I've got we can go there if you want. There's a whole jawboning is a form of this censorship industrial complex. But there are many other aspects of it that jawboning doesn't require the whole of society element to it. Jawboning is one of the levers that the government side of whole of society can pull. For example, it might not be enough. Sometimes jawboning will not be enough to move a social media platform to take down a narrative, to take out an account, to have the blowback that comes from that. Sometimes there are other levers that need to be pulled in order to make the censorship happen. For example, the organization of an advertiser boycott. It might be the case that a distribution channel or ABC or NBC or Sinclair might say, you know what, I don't care. Go ahead. Don't approve this merger if this means so much to you. Out of my own sense of integrity, I'm going to continue to platform this artist or this TV show host. Well, in that case, the U.S. government may need to dip into the whole of society network through its other corporate partners who do business with that outlet, or advertising pools. There's the big six advertising conglomerates, and all of them get hundreds of millions of dollars of government contracts. Some of them get billions of dollars of government contracts because they get contracts for the U.S. military to do all of its advertising, or for HHS to do all of its advertising. If jawboning doesn't work, what the U.S. government can do is it can go to that advertising conglomerate and say, hey, we're going to give that $1.2 billion U.S. Army advertising contract to your competitor if you don't cut advertising on ABC or NBC for hosting this TV show. And that might be a much bigger deal to that network than not getting a license to operate in a particular jurisdiction, or not getting a merger approval for a deal they were skittish on in the first place. In that case, it's not the government directly, but this is effectively plausible deniability. This is like saying the First Amendment prevents me from walking over to someone as the government and pulling the trigger that shoots that speech in the head. But contract killing is allowed. Murder for hire is allowed if I, the U.S. government, essentially engage a corporation or a nonprofit or a university center or a think tank and NGO network to do this, and they're getting government money or government grants. That is effectively the gray area that the censorship industrial complex moves in, so that everything can move together and they can tailor what is needed in order to eliminate any narrative, depending on what it is, depending on the strengths of the different four corners of that whole society model. For example, the media can create this amplification funnel, and it can exaggerate the pressure on an advertising campaign by amplifying Facebook's sins to the world for hosting a particular harmful narrative about a certain thing. But the New York Times can't just walk over to, for example, Lockheed Martin and directly threaten $2 billion in military contracts like the U.S. government can. But the U.S. government can't just walk over to a particular media outlet and tell them not to publish something. And so they all move in sync. And this is not a model that was created for the censorship industrial complex. This is actually, this whole society model comes from our counterinsurgency doctrine and essentially the way we waged the Cold War, which was that when the U.S. government wants to exert influence over Vietnam or Honduras or Guatemala, it's not just the U.S. State Department or military boots on the ground. They would work with United Fruit, and United Fruit would have a nonprofit philanthropic foundation that sponsors civil society organizations and media outlets in the area. And so Hondurans living in Honduras or Guatemalans living in Guatemalans wouldn't even know how they are being influenced, because they would see so many of their own Guatemalan or Honduran civil society organizations seeming like it's coming from their people by their people, and not being apprised of where the funding comes from or how the sausage is made in the background.
Well, you said that Elon taking over Twitter, that was a big turning point.
Yeah.
I can tell you I like Twitter before Elon a lot better than Twitter after Elon. There is so much hate speech that goes on with accounts that are just completely untouched. Like, you literally see accounts that are completely anti-Semitic or completely anti-Black or completely anti-gay, and they continue to function and they have millions of views. Why do you feel that Elon taking over Twitter was a turning point?
I think when you actually make something forbidden fruit, it can actually make it seem tastier than it is. And I think that, this kind of gets back to what we were talking about with the 5G towers and the like. Remember, Donald Trump, the president, if you still had Twitter 1.0, you'd have a sitting president of the United States who is not allowed on the most influential global influence platform on social media. Twitter is the smallest of the social media platforms, but according to foreign policy journals and international affairs and political science journals, it is by far the most influential, because it is where the thought leadership is cooked, and you don't need a video and high production value to get your message out. You can tweet a slogan in 4 words from a toilet seat and have 100 million people. If you're the Prime Minister Modi or something, it is a major vector of U.S. statecraft. The U.S. State Department relies on Twitter X to influence and mobilize revolutions. You had hashtag revolutions during the Arab Spring, and you're going to have this situation where the President of the United States is not allowed on, but the executive agencies under the Commander-in-Chief's command is are all using it and dependent on it. You're going to have U.S. national security vectors using Twitter to influence paramilitary groups, but the commander-in-chief is banned because of something he didn't even imply on January 6th. I mean, the last thing that Trump...
Wait, hold on. I'm gonna push back on this one. So Twitter permanently suspended Trump due to risk of further incitement of violence. This was immediately following a Stop the Steal rally, which implied that the election was stolen, which ultimately went through every court system and it was shown that it was not stolen. He actually lost that election.
Vlad.
So to me, that actually makes sense at that moment. Now later on, having him put back on makes sense as well.
That thing you just said, that he was removed for incitement around violence. What's the date of that reporting from what you're reading?
January 8th.
Okay. Run a Google search for Jack Dorsey, Trump ban business decision.
Jack Dorsey's business decision was to uphold the permanent ban of Donald Trump from Twitter in January 2021, citing public safety concerns, the risk of further incitement of violence after the January 6th Capitol riot. He defended the decision as necessary at the time, saying it was the right decision for Twitter under extraordinary and untenable circumstances. However, years later, Dorsey also stated he believes permanent bans of individuals are directionally wrong and that business should not be the ones making such decisions for public discourse.
The point I'm getting at here is there was an enormous advertising pressure on these companies. And make no mistake, all of these foreign policy blob outlets, influence vectors had been planning for months about how to cut Trump's megaphone after if he were to lose the election. There's a great, I think it was in the Transition Integrity Project, June 2020 publication, where they wargamed how to install Joe Biden as the president, even under scenario 3, which was called Clear Trump Win, by organizing a domestic color revolution, building off of the back of the Black Lives Matter street protests that had just begun 2 weeks earlier, and various Antifa and related paramilitary nodes to, even if Trump had won the Electoral College, to make the argument that it was still illegitimate because of the popular vote, and that they could essentially pry off enough members of Congress and have states threaten secession. This Cascadia Western states concept they wargamed. They had John Podesta wargaming this. Everyone can look this up. It's called the Transition Integrity Project. You can see all the receipts on my X account if you can't find it on Google easily, but you can. This is all very public. And one of the things they had as an addendum to that June 2020 white paper summarizing their war game on how to install Biden, even if Trump won, was an addendum. I think it was called like an Appendix A, and it referred to Trumpism after Trump. How do we stop when Trump loses the election 5 months from now? The problem is he still has this enormous Twitter megaphone. And no matter what Joe Biden does as president, there will be questions about the legitimacy of Biden's win because we're projecting a red mirage, blue shift event, because their projection was that if Biden would win, it would happen. It was almost certain he was going to lose on election night, but that there would be this blue shift event, as they calculated, as these universal mass mail-in ballots, first time ever used, would roll in, and Biden would essentially win after election night, and you would have this whiplash moment where half the country, the Trump supporters, would think that their guy won, and then they would feel the election was stolen from them, and this would dog Biden throughout his whole presidency, because Trump would have this enormous social media megaphone to amplify that messaging. And then no matter what Biden tried to do on foreign policy, if he wanted to radically change, depart from Trump isolationism or Trump policy around Ukraine and Russia or Trump policy on Iran or Trump policy on Syria or Iraq or international interventions, that Trump would always be there with a much louder megaphone than the president himself, and half the country thinking he's the legitimate president. And that would undermine diplomatic messaging, diplomatic consensus building, and it would basically hold back the entire Biden administration and stop them from getting their agenda done unless Trump's megaphone was cut. This was openly plotted in the open months before the ban. This was not something like, oh, my hands are tied. God, the problem is Trump is just inciting violence. They were champing at the bit for any excuse. And do you remember what the last thing Trump posted on Twitter? If you're going to use incitement to violence as the reason for this, the last thing Trump posted on Twitter before he was taken out was a personal, heartfelt, direct-to-camera video of him telling the January 6th protesters to go home, that they had made their point, but the time is now to go home. They actually banned Trump. And the only way you can read that, if you're going to talk about incitement to violence, is they wanted violence to occur. Because they banned Trump when he said...
I can't agree with that.
Well, you're the one who brought this up.
Mike, I was with you until you said that. I'm not going to agree with that.
But tell me this, why wouldn't you want that message to get more amplification than ever? Why would you want to make that message, the very last thing he tweeted, completely inaccessible because you've banned the whole account?
I think at that very moment, there was a serious fear that these types of, capital attacks was about to happen all over the country, with a bunch of people that were very much believing that the election was stolen. And look, at the end of the day, I truly believe that Biden won that election, and I truly believe that Trump won the next election.
Listen,
okay?
I don't
think there was any ballot stuffing or cyber warfare that happened. At the end of the day,
I've got my own opinions on that, but
right.
I don't get into people can have their own opinions on that.
People can have their own opinions, but at the end of the day, at that moment, there was a lot of anti-Trump sentiment, and I think a lot of people got out and voted not for Biden but against Trump during that election. And during the next election, I think people ultimately saw, well, Trump wasn't that bad of a guy. You had a very weak candidate in Kamala. Biden was not able to keep the election going, and Trump legitimately won. And he won by a large margin. At the end of the day, nobody was saying, Kamala wasn't saying that the election was stolen or anything else like that, but this whole stop the steal, the election is stolen, something he's never, let go of. I think there was an actual fear, not for the country to be taken over, but for more violence to occur. Because there was an unpredictable aspect in terms of Trump was going to do next. Yes, that last tweet was something that needed to be amplified, but then there could have been a tweet afterwards that said, everyone attack every Capitol building because they're stealing the election. And then at that point, all hell would have broken loose. So I agree with that decision. I also agree with the fact that he got it back later.
Weird that they didn't ban before that. They only banned him when he told people to go home. And listen, this is kind of...
But it all happened right around the same time. It was all happening within an hour of each other.
Vlad, I probably know more about the January 6th event than any single human on planet Earth. And we could sidebar there and talk, the level of depth on this that I could snow you with on this we could do 100 hours just on everything that happened in the background on that. So I'm just to keep this kind of focused on the censorship side of this. I'm going to say you can believe whatever you want to believe about this. You don't really see me talking about whether or not the 2020 election was legitimate or illegitimate or still I have my opinions on that. I think it's a little bit of a distraction from the core apparatus that I publish about and promote policy on the basis of. One of the things that I think is useful to understand about the 2020 election cycle is how the censorship happened way before Trump was banned himself, through these very same networks, these Atlantic Council networks that I was talking about earlier, that played a role in pre-censorship of anything that might challenge a hypothetical upcoming red mirage blue shift event. This was this group, it's called the Election Integrity Partnership, for example, which was anchored by the Atlantic Council, their Digital Forensics Research Lab, DFR lab. So the Atlantic Council, again, as I mentioned, 7 CIA directors on their board, government funded from the U.S. military, State Department, National Endowment for Democracy, CIA cutouts like that, USAID. They had a formal partnership with this anti-Trump node at DHS called CISA. It was the cyber censorship. It was supposed to be a cybersecurity division, but they ended up asserting long-arm jurisdiction over social media posts by arguing that elections are critical infrastructure, so anything that undermines public faith and confidence in elections, election processes, or election outcomes is an attack on critical infrastructure. So if you, in the summer of 2020, tweeted out, hey, I don't think that universal mass mail-in ballots are a safe and reliable way to conduct an election, I think it's a little weird that you can't, that these states don't require signatures or proof of citizenship or anything like this. That was pre-censored by some of the darkest forces that operate within this CIA, military, State Department nexus, who all had extreme beefs with President Trump. The Atlantic Council was the anchor of that, along with Graphica. As I mentioned, Graphica there were four entities in this partnership, the Election Integrity Partnership. It was the Atlantic Council, Graphica, Stanford University, and the University of Washington. But I'll stick with the Atlantic Council and the Graphica side. As I mentioned, Graphica, the representative from Graphica, is who presented to NATO 1 year before that in 2019 about how Taylor Swift is an example of someone who could be trained to spread desired messaging about NATO to win hearts and minds in Central and Eastern Europe, that they get millions of dollars in Pentagon contracts to map the spread of narratives of political communities around the world. They and the Atlantic Council got a formal partnership with the Department of Homeland Security in a very particular cell that, even though they were Republicans, they were never Trump Republicans. This is Chris Krebs. He was the one who was in charge of CISA at the time. He got fired for kind of unrelated reasons, but after the election. And what they did was this group, the Atlantic Council and Graphica and their partners, got special proprietary access to DHS's 24/7 cyber mission control that had a back channel to the trust and safety teams of every social media company, not just the majors like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, but all the way down to like Discord and Reddit. And this was set up because CISA at DHS was stood up to stop, Russian hacking and Russian influence operations that were alleged from the 2016 election. And so DHS already had high-level back-channel access to the top trust and safety content moderators about Russian disinformation. And then ahead of the 2020 election, they switched a focus from 80% foreign, 20% domestic to 80% domestic, 20% foreign. They switched to censoring the 2020 election and pre-censoring specifically anything that might undermine the legitimacy of a Biden come-from-behind victory. Anything around strangeness with electronic voting machines, strangeness with early voting drop boxes, strangeness with mass mail-in ballots. By their own reports, their AI ingested 859 million tweets and assessed that 22 million of those tweets were misinformation. And they broke it all down by category. Everything was pre-censored so that you could not even have the political process. If you're the state of Ohio and you're deciding whether or not you want to require a ballot signature, that process was shortcut because you were not able to even have a debate about the kind of voting processes we would use. You were not, these same people from this same network had no problem undermining the legitimacy of the 2016 election by alleging that Russia stole the election for Trump, or Russia, Trump is an illegitimate president because Putin helped him win. But then they used that as the predicate. And they meticulously documented in a timeline chronology that you can just put on screen right here in their communiques with the Department of Homeland Security and in their own formal reports. And then they got millions of dollars from the U.S. government under the Biden administration after censoring the Biden administration's political opponents to help them win. How they went platform by platform, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, Discord, TikTok, to get every single company to take proactive steps to implement a brand new terms of service policy called delegitimization way before the 2020 election, 5 months before the 2020 election even happened to pre-censor anyone who might delegitimize an upcoming hypothetical Biden victory. That is messed up on a level that is hard to comprehend. The collateral damage that was done, the amount of content creators who were nuked because they delegitimized the upcoming election because they questioned voting machines or mass mail-in ballots or early voting drop boxes or any of those things, whether they're true or not, was not even able to be litigated because you knew as a content creator, you watched and you saw Gateway Pundit go down. You watched and you saw Marjorie Taylor Greene getting effectively shut down over COVID. Well, hold on, because the Election Integrity Project rebranded as the Virality Project for COVID censorship after the 2020 election. But as a content creator, you know, Vlad, you said this yourself. When you had someone on and they said something about COVID and you got a strike on your channel, you go, holy shit. Listen, I can't talk. I don't even want to, whether it's true or not, I don't want to talk about that because I'll have trouble paying my mortgage, putting bread on the table for my family. And so that chills the entire, whether you can even litigate the truth or falsity of any narrative. And then they just expanded that to everything. Climate, Ukraine, you name it.
Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene has tweeted that there's Jewish lasers that are attacking people and the such. Like certain things are just a bit crazy. Like you can't really have these types of things just go out, especially if this is an elected official. Like I actually don't mind that she was censored on Twitter. Like you don't believe a lot of stuff she says.
No,
as an intelligent person.
I've had Marjorie Taylor Greene. What was reported about the Jewish space lasers comment? But you're going to enter that into evidence. Do you know exactly what she said?
Sure. Hold on a second.
I've had conversations with her where I don't remember the exact words, but I remember I have a memory of her implying that whatever was reported was cartoonishly taken out of context, and either she was joking or it was something like it was kind of unrelated.
She was talking about the fires, and she blamed them on Jewish space lasers.
What's the exact quote she said? She blamed fires on Jewish space lasers?
It's a very long post. It's from November 17, 2018. There are now over 70 people confirmed dead, over 1,000 missing in the California fires. Okay, then there are all these people who said they saw what looked like lasers or blue beams of light causing the fires, and pictures and videos. I don't know anything about it, but I do find it really curious about the PG&E partnership. The idea of clean energy to replace, the idea is clean energy to replace coal and oil. If they're beaming the sun's energy back to Earth, I'm sure they couldn't ever miss a transmitter receiving a station, right? Mistakes. Hold on a second. Is there a different tweet?
No, I think that people put those words in her mouth.
Hold on a second. Hold on.
I doubt that she would seriously, even if that phrase was used, I would imagine it would be like some tongue-in-cheek sort of almost, take the air out of the room a little bit with some of the, kind of tense implications of a laser theory causing a fire. But yeah. I don't know that she even
right. So I'm sure about, this is what it's inferring right here. A laser beam or light beam coming down to Earth, I guess, could cause a fire. I don't know. I hope not. That wouldn't look like so good for PG&E. Rothschild Incorporated, Solera, or Jerry Brown, who sure does seem fond of PG&E. I guess she's referring that the Rothschilds are somehow tied to these space lasers. But I see what you're saying. She's not exactly saying it, but there is sort of.
It's. So you think an elected representative, a sitting member of Congress, chairwoman of a congressional subcommittee around oversight should be permanently banned from access to all of her constituents, the American nation she represents and reports to, because of a non-committal, curious, preliminary hypothesis about lasers and fires, and an offhand reference to bankers who are affiliated with the Rothschilds. Like, I mean, Vlad, have you ever said anything online? I mean, if I'm going to permanently ban you, you've never been curious about, okay, you're curious about like something going on with a label and, or you're curious about who may have assassinated, shot up some musician or something. And you're not sure what happened. You're having to speculate. You don't necessarily trust the authorities on what's been published on it. Investigations were cut short, or it's a very sparse record, but you know some people. You got some circumstantial evidence. You have some experience in the industry. You're exploring some hypothesis. You put it out there that you're doing that, and that might have implications for something. For example, who killed a particular musician or how did someone die may have implications for U.S. national security. There are people who go out there and say things like, was the CIA involved in killing Tupac Shakur? Well, look at what that might do. If that hypothesis were to be believed, we might lose the Pan-African hip-hop community, or in Latin America, the Caribbean, the Sahel, Sub-Saharan Africa, to Russian or Chinese influence, because they all hate the U.S. government because they think the CIA is behind everything, because some BS theory that Vlad spread on his multi-million follower subscriber account YouTube channel. In the interest of what you said is false or unsubstantiated, it sounds a little bit crazy. You didn't provide enough receipts to really substantiate it, and it could potentially have blowback on very real U.S. national security, and soft power influence, and a Russian and Chinese political party may rise to power, and foreign politicians may be holding up, blasting your misinformation YouTube video about who killed Tupac Shakur to millions of people on a big screen event in Nairobi next month, and you've just forfeited. I think of how many Americans are going to die because this extremist group backed by the Chinese swung to power because of your misinformation video. So bye-bye to your entire business, Vlad. Bye-bye to everything you've built over, 10, 15 years. Like everything that you've built, ground up, boom. Do you want someone to have that power over you, Vlad?
Look, I mean, ironically enough, I helped solve the Tupac murder case by bringing in one of the people involved in the murder. But I think the way Twitter handles it, where if there is a statement from a prominent person that starts to really get a lot of traction and it potentially is false or misleading, that it gets referenced, that this tweet potentially has a problem, and here's another piece of information that you could cross-reference. Do I believe that Marjorie needs to be banned? No. I also don't believe that Trump needed to be permanently banned. I just felt at that moment it was a dangerous time. At that very moment, it was a dangerous time. Now, if they would have given his account back a week later, I would have been okay with that also. I don't believe in a permanent ban. But you also can't have a situation where you have a potential for a serious insurgence where a lot of people are going to lose their lives, their freedom, and so forth. People lost their lives during the Capitol 6 riot.
Oh, Trump supporters did.
Police did.
No. You're going to talk about Officer Brian Sicknick? What was it?
It was a heart attack, right?
Yeah.
One of the cops had a heart attack?
Well, but there was no homicide. If you beat someone and they have a heart attack.
No, there was not a homicide. That is correct.
No, you can't put that on Trump supporters. There was no one.
I think if you cause a riot of that stature and someone has a heart attack who's trying to protect the situation, I think those two situations go together.
And you're just legally flat wrong. There were two people who were charged. No, there were two people. I broke this story around the blood libel with Brian Sicknick because they tried to hold that up for months. And two people were charged because of a pepper spray incident that had happened sometime around 3 p.m. that day. And they were charged initially with a kind of like assault type charge because some of the pepper spray from a distance had gotten on Sicknick, and they were trying to launch that into a homicide charge until the autopsy came out.
Actually, I think you're right, because the police officer died from a stroke the day after the attack.
Yes. And
so he was assaulted, but he was assaulted the day before by rioters and collapsed.
Did you
So you could actually
Whoa.
hold one. No,
Whoa,
so
no,
actually,
well, wait a
I'm
second,
going
wait
to
a
hold on
second.
to what I'm saying. He was assaulted, and the next day he died.
No. What was the assault? Did you see the video of the assault? Okay. Well, I did, and I published all about it. It's in Revolver News.
Okay.
And this was, there were communications with him and his family. This is like this is hours after the event when he started feeling that he had, been sick or whatever. It was months after they withheld. It was really funny the way the autopsy, the struggle to actually get public awareness about the autopsy, because they used Officer Sicknick's death as a way to sneak in the word fatal. Like what you'll see from like January 2021, if you run a Boolean search in Google and you set like before July 2021, like you'll see they were always using that fatal January 6th. And everyone said, well, where's the autopsy? Because they were making this sound like a homicide. And if they could show any causal relationship between what was done by the two folks who were initially charged with the assault on camera, apparent assault, this was basically like pepper spray from a very, very far distance. You don't think the Merrick Garland Justice Department would have tried a homicide charge if they could prove that there was any relation whatsoever, that what you're saying is true?
I see what you're saying. You're right. You know more about the story than I do. You're absolutely right.
The January 6th stuff is complicated. And like, I don't want to get too bogged down in that because, look, I understand there was a really high power media campaign around January 6th stuff. And it unlocked a lot of government powers in terms of what was done in the aftermath of that. And if you like to understand the kind of cinematic universe of that is there's just a lot of different moving parts between the national security state, all the different stakeholders in the civil society and advertising and social media space. Like I only brought up this is another thing, by the way. I mean, I should note that it is a little curious that the Transition Integrity Project that I mentioned, who was set up to try to find a way to have Biden installed as president, even if Trump won, in June 2020, as part of the simulation that John Podesta personally role-played Joe Biden in, and then John Podesta was promoted to run the $374 billion climate slush fund for the Biden White House. So instead of being in prison for this, he was promoted to, a third of $1 trillion crony climate fund. But one of the things that is in this, and I'll send you the receipt, you can put it on screen. This was published in mainstream media reporting. One of their plans in their war game simulation is a plan to, quote, induce a breakdown on January 6th in order to stop the vote from going through and make the alternate election so that Trump would not be certified on election day, so that there would be this kind of crisis moment. There'd be a constitutional crisis around Trump's legitimacy because he didn't win the popular vote. And at the time, they're making a big deal about, there's not really a legitimate election unless, this is why D.C. has to be made a state. And we need to get rid of the Electoral College. You have these Harvard law professors talking about ending the Electoral College. And this same network had a plan in place and war gamed it with the highest levels of both political parties. Part of the Transition Integrity Project was Donna Brazile, the former head of the DNC, Michael Steele, the former head of the RNC, but never Trump Republican, high-level military, intelligence, statecraft, and political operatives on both sides of the aisle, the Bush-Clinton wing of it. They had an explicit plan to invoke a breakdown on January 6th, 5 months before that. Now, again, what I'm saying here is the picture is very complicated, and we can go through all the networks there, but just to get it back on the censorship thing, whatever you think of the January 6th event, you have this censorship industrial complex, which sometimes uses a national security predicate like, domestic extremism, as with January 6th, but will sometimes do it on like energy policy, what you can say about climate change. The Disinformation Governance Board that was set up in 2022 had a section for policing speech about the Ukraine conflict. When when you have this, you can always find a reason to say that any narrative that is of any consequence whatsoever to public policy will have an effect on U.S. national interests or U.S. national security. What you say about climate change, Russia uses fossil fuels disproportionately. Part of the clean energy push is because it would help bankrupt Russia. If you get people off of oil and you get people using renewables, this was seen as a way of basically depriving Russia of its main economic powerhouse, starting in the early 2000s when Russia started using, gas diplomacy and leveraging Europe's dependence on Russian oil and like. So if you are against climate change, you're pro-Putin. You can make that argument. And you can say, look at how many people are going to die in Ukraine because of your policy, your speech about climate policy. And you can do this with pretty much anything. And if you give the government the power to do that, I don't want the Trump admin to have this power. This is like one of these, like the Ring. They have to, in Lord of the Rings, they throw it into the fires of Mordor and instead of Frodo keeping it, because this thing is it's a God button. Whoever holds that can stay in power forever. And frankly, I'd think if Elon hadn't bought X, and if Biden wasn't reliant on Elon in many ways, because Elon's a very unique figure in this, and we can maybe segue to that, but it wasn't just that someone bought Twitter who had a different political orientation. It's that Elon is, the national security state is dependent on Elon in many respects. SpaceX, all of our, if the CIA wants to, use the telecommunications and GPS and to track, you can bet it's going to be from a SpaceX satellite. Something like two-thirds of all satellites in orbit are from Elon Musk's SpaceX company, which itself grew out of, State Department diplomatic endeavors to be able to get the initial missiles and ballistics for SpaceX to be able to do. And they, built on government contracts with the U.S. military, the U.S. State Department, the intelligence services. I mean, even something like Tesla. Tesla was seen as a Democrat company for the longest time. And Elon was associated with Democrats because Tesla was the magic corporate battering ram for American global leadership in the renewable energy space, because the marvel of the innovation of Tesla batteries would make America the global leader in this brand new way of storing energy rather than Russia or China. And when we overthrew the government of Bolivia, Elon even took to Twitter after being criticized because Bolivia is part of this lithium triangle, and one of the things that's required for Tesla batteries is lithium. And Elon said, "We will coup whoever we want." Effectively insinuating that it's actually important to American interests to overthrow a foreign government to get access to lithium to build renewable batteries, so that America can lead in the clean energy space. And Democrats didn't have a problem with that then. And Elon named one of his sons after a CIA project. Right now, as we're doing battle against Russia, it's dependent on Starlink. There are so many ways that it almost took someone from that system. If it was somebody else, if it was someone who had made $100 billion off of a lemonade stand business, and you could just indict him. You just have the Justice Department give him 20 years for premeditated jaywalking. But if you did that to Elon, he could in theory shut off Starlink. There goes all your drone warfare in Ukraine. He could theoretically, divest, Tesla to somebody who wants to go in a completely different direction or cut off the ability to leverage that for our energy diplomacy. But if you didn't have someone like Elon, you could have had a China system right here, because this censorship industrial complex would stop anybody else from being able to amplify their message, and you have a one-party state.
Well, you said that the deep state has 3 layers.
Yeah.
Describe each one.
So you have permanent Washington in the government agencies. So these are, so the blob here is the foreign policy establishment. This was the Obama White House definition of it. But it's important to understand that even domestic agencies kind of glob onto that. But at the core of it is the State Department, the War Department, and the CIA. And then USAID sits in the middle of those. So when we had our first meeting of Congress as the United States of America in 1789, we created 3 government agencies: the State Department, the War Department, and the Treasury Department. I think we also created a Navy, but you can think of that as the War Department. So the State Department managed all of our world affairs on national interest. We had trade agreements that we were setting up. We had, supply chains with importing and exporting goods, tea and the like, for example, with the Boston, Tea Party event, etc., sugar. And we had a War Department for effectively national security, and then we had the Treasury Department for money. What happened over time is that State Department function, managing the American economy, managing American corporate power and American soft power influence in foreign countries, began to be a bigger and bigger task as America grew as an empire. 1898, we win the Spanish-American War. We get acquisition over basically Cuba, but also the Philippines. We militarily occupied the Philippines. Now we need a navy to protect our military empire. And then World War I, World War II. By the end of World War II, we now have a globe-spanning empire because we have a Marshall Plan in place where we are essentially paying European countries to have pro-American influence nodes. We are beginning to leverage that so that American companies can set up markets and have all these, hundreds of millions of new customers, supply chains, economic development. And we are getting rich as a country in the 20th century because all these American companies are now taking over the world and they're operating everywhere. They're getting really good deals because the State Department is juicing it. But at that time in the 1940s, after the Cold War, international law under the UN Declaration on Human Rights prohibited the ability to militarily occupy another country and have it be legal under international law. So we had to switch from overt military occupation to covert political influence in order to achieve the same effect, which is vassal state control, puppet control over a foreign government. So they nominally elect their own leader, but they have a Coke and Pepsi choice between the same product, 2 parties back-channeled by the U.S. State Department. So 1948, as international law is set up, the State Department bifurcates effectively. The State Department comes up with this idea that we should have a organized political warfare apparatus to covertly influence every country around the world. But because it has to be covert, it can't be housed within the State Department. We wouldn't be able to conceal it in our budget. We need to keep a layer of plausible deniability. So they proposed, this is George Kennan at the State Department in 1948, proposes the Central Intelligence Agency essentially take on this function as the covert arm of the State Department. When the Marshall Plan ran out in 1961, USAID, it goes international with USAID. And this is essentially a bribery, a influence capacity to use foreign assistance funds, humanitarian funds, development funds to pay groups, political networks, foundations to pass through onto other parties all around the world at a global scale in order to influence hearts and minds to help what the CIA and State Department want to do in the region. Meanwhile, and then on the national security side, you have the Department of War, but even the Department of War has something called the Civil Affairs Branch, which involves hearts and minds work. So psychological operations, special forces often work with CIA and often work with USAID and the State Department to coordinate that hearts and minds campaign. This is how you see, for example, something like NATO having a planning meeting around whether Taylor Swift might be trainable to spread desired NATO messaging. You might be wondering, well, why is the military involved in that? Well, because this is part of this interagency blob. They move seamlessly together. Hillary Clinton, for example, when she was Secretary of State, had this model that she called the 3D model. Diplomacy, defense, and development always move together. Everywhere USAID works, they work with the U.S. military. If the USAID is doing a job fair in the region, the military knows about it. If the military is working with paramilitary groups that they want to do street protests or riots, and they're going to get fired by their Chinese employers in Africa if they take to the streets and riots, well, USAID can jump in with a job fair to help these economically disadvantaged folks fired from their Chinese factory jobs so that they can stay on the streets and protest and riot to help the DOD, Special Forces, paramilitary operation to overthrow the government in a street revolution. And so these things work symbiotically, but that's the middle layer of it. Diplomacy, war, intelligence, development, and these jobs are interchangeable. Like under Trump, Mike Pompeo was the head of the CIA. Very next job, he was promoted to Secretary of State. Notice he was promoted. You never go backwards that way. Nobody goes from Secretary of State to CIA director. That's a down step. The CIA director is the kids' table. You're operating at the behest of the CIA, of the State Department or the War Department. You're the covert. You're the dirty work. You're essentially the hitman. You're not the mob boss. But what I'm getting at here is, Mike Pompeo went from CIA director to Secretary of State. How about Bill Clinton's CIA director, Leon Panetta, goes from CIA director to Secretary of War. These jobs are interchangeable. You can work at the CIA, the State Department, the Department of War, and USAID. It's the exact same resume. It's just the same job with a slightly different emphasis. But because it's the same job, they form one blob. And all of the different network nodes, the public-facing State Department nodes, the covert, secret influence CIA nodes, the public-facing military networks, the covert special forces soft power influence networks, the public-facing USAID grant programs, the covert subgrants and grantee and contractor network, they blend together as one mush, as one blob. So that's kind of the central guts layer, and it's a permanent thing because all these agencies have this fascinating dichotomy between politicals and careers. The president only gets to pick about 5,000 people to work for the government. All the other millions of federal government employees are like careers. They are there through Republican, through Democrat, and they're very hard to fire. And so there is a permanent bureaucracy that is able to control the levers and put their own kind of press on policy so that a president often has a really hard time getting something done unless the whole blob agrees that it should be done. And then above that, you got this banker and corporate class. These are the people who pay for the political campaigns. These are the people who sponsor, these are the multinational corporation, conglomerate, private equity, hedge fund folks. And this is tale as old as time. I mean, this is like, you can go back to United Fruit in the 1800s sponsoring presidents, and then presidents direct their Secretary of State or their Secretary of War to do things in Honduras and Guatemala that profit United Fruit. Today, that plays out with, on the Democrat side, figures like George Soros, the number one donor to the Democrat Party, will pay for these political campaigns, and then a State Department policy on Brazil will promote Lula over Bolsonaro when Lula is implementing clean ethanol mandates that the Soros Management Fund is invested in. So they get a government-protected cartel so that Brazilians are forced to buy Soros portfolio company products because the election has been effectively rigged by Joe Biden sending his CIA director, Bill Burns, his Secretary of War, Lloyd Austin, his Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland, down there, and spending tens of millions of U.S. aid funding to back Lula groups. But that is not a partisan thing. That happens on the Republican side too. This is Paul Singer. If you look up, his operations the same way. The Bush family and the big oil movement. I mean, who was Trump's first Secretary of State? It was Rex Tillerson, the chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil. He never worked in the State Department a day in his life, but he ran the world's biggest oil company, and a huge proportion of the Republican Party's power comes from the oil industry. And so you have these big oil, big energy, big military folks who contribute to Republicans, and then Republicans effectively donate them a Secretary of State or an Undersecretary who makes sure that they get their cut. But that is how the system works.
Well, last question before I let you go. Independent media analysis website Media Bias/Fact Check rates your organization, Foundation for Freedom Online, as right biased and questionable due to promotion of conspiracy theories, failed fact checks, and lack of transparency on funding. Are you familiar with the site?
Is this like? I mean, this is like dime a dozen. There's 10,000 fact checker. They're all the same. It's all the same people. And I mean, if you're asking me what I think about it, like this 0 is the amount of fucks that I give about what any fucking fact checker says about my shit. I put all my receipts on screen. I meticulously document everything. My work has been entered into Supreme Court briefs. It's been entered into the congressional record half a dozen times in congressional hearings. I think what I do is top-notch, world-class, and frankly, I don't consider it to be a right-wing bias, even though I know that it manifests as such. I would be happy working for a Democrat president who was consistent about these things. If Bobby Kennedy, for example, ran as a Democrat in a future election, or Tulsi Gabbard did, I could very easily see myself serving under those. I don't have any animosity on those partisan grounds, and I frequently talk about how the blob oppresses left-wing outlets or movements. I talked about how the gray zone is blacklisted by Wikipedia, and how the Atlantic Council was going after the gray zone in their there's very little that I would necessarily. We may not agree on many things, but we agree on. To me, the core part is the process. I don't mind having someone I like lose an election as long as I feel like there's a fair process, and I have a chance to come back stronger and change my tactics, and maybe I can win next time. But when there's this total hopelessness, like, wait, they can just squash me like a bug, and if I even try, I am getting my hopes up so that I'll just get banned after 10 years. I mean, you lose a marriage that way. Your kids see you as a loser. You go in to try to create a media channel on YouTube or a big, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, social media thing, and then one day the rug just gets pulled onto you because the very thing that you were trying to promote change in, these faceless blob figures in some email correspondence that you'll never get access to because the FOIA, you can't FOIA it because they're holding the records off-site at an NGO who has zero records retention policy under law because they've structured this in this whole society way so that they can basically censor you without you even being able to have any accountability. Like that to me is the existential threat. What happens seasonally with politics, things come and go. But I stand by everything that I do in my work.
Well, they mentioned the lack of transparency on funding. Who actually funds your organization, Foundation for Freedom Online?
Well, we have a very, very small number of just individual donors who believe in the work that we do, and we operate as a project. This is essentially like any number of standard NGO projects that have a fiscal sponsorship relationship, through a 501c3 sponsor.
And before I let you go, why haven't you rejoined the Trump organization now that he's reelected?
There's a lot of work that needs to be done from my perspective as an investigative journalist. And to me, what's important is to publish findings, go through the source documents that are long and take a lot of peripheral vision to understand how networks and things like that move together. And I consider that, or at least I've considered it to date, to be more important for public policy than formulating public policy. If you don't know what's happening at USAID, how do you make a USAID policy on the basis of it? If you don't know what you inherited at the State Department or the Department of War or with these NGO relationships, how do you know how to leverage them as part of the National Security Council? And so it may be the case that I end up joining this admin or a future admin. I have no aversion to it, but I just follow my North Star, which is just effectively my day-to-day work.
Well, that's what it is. Mike Benz, appreciate you coming in. A lot of interesting perspectives. I don't agree with every single thing you're saying, but I think that's the point of having conversations like this, where you could state things and people could push back and there could be some level of discourse, but ultimately people could decide for themselves what they truly believe. I think there's facts on both sides. I think what you're doing actually is important because I don't think anyone wants censorship, an over amount of censorship. When you go to places like China, you can't say anything about the government.
Yeah.
You can't say, I hate the government, I wish the president something bad will happen to him. You'll get thrown in jail.
Yeah.
So right away. People like to think that the way it works in America applies everywhere. Go to Dubai and say something about the king of Dubai and see what happens to you. Right?
Yeah.
Famously, there's that big in Saudi Arabia. They had that big comedy festival, and Dave Chappelle, went on the stage and said, "I feel I could be a lot more free with what I say here." Oh, really?
Right.
Make a joke about 9/11.
Yes,
Make a joke about the journalists who got chopped up. See what happens on your way home.
Right.
So, I think what you're doing is very important, and I think censorship is ultimately a bad thing. I think free speech is a great thing. I'm here because of free speech, and continue to do your work.
Well, likewise, I appreciate your perspective. I think what you're doing is super cool. I don't want the Trump administration to have the power to take you out because you disagree with them. I think that's messed up. And disagreements, it's like family. They come and go. At the end of the day, though, there are certain things you don't do to family, and we're all in this together at a human level. And appreciate you having me on. Really enjoyed it.
That's what it is. Until next time. Peace.
Peace.